Hey, what is going on, everybody? Bauer Brown here. Welcome back to the channel, guys, and welcome to the next video in the Blender tutorial series. Alrighty, it's been about a week since my last video. I've been taking a little bit of time to, one, deal with this flu or whatever it is that's been going around and totally kicking my butt. And number two, it was the holiday season. I hope everybody had a safe and happy holiday. Right. So whether it's school or work or whatever your deal might be, hopefully you got a little bit of time off to spend with your family, friends, your loved ones, or even just yourself and just decompress a little bit and have a good time. Alrighty. So like I said, happy holidays and I hope it was enjoyable for everybody. All right. So I don't know where I left off with the Blender series, but I do know where I want to pick back up, and that would be with materials. All right. So when I was starting out, materials were a little bit confusing to me. It just, not that there was a lot to it. I think I was making more out of it. I just didn't understand. Right. And now I know that it's much more simpler than what I thought it was. And that's going to be my goal here with you guys, is to simplify things so it's not as confusing as it was for me. All right. So with the material, no matter what you want to do, as far as your object goes. So let's look at this cube here. Okay. So let's pretend that this cube is something that, we created and we want to do something with it. Whether, we want to give it like a brick texture, or we just want to give it a color or what have you. That all starts with a material, everything, no matter what you want to do. Maybe even working on some fancy textures or what have you, you need a material. So you can think of a material kind of like a collection of defining characteristics, whether that's, opacity, or if it's a color, or it's a texture, maybe you have an image texture. That's all part of the material. The material basically defines, what characteristics, or properties that this cube is going to have. A good example of that is if you would look inside of your Giants editor, right? And you have an object selected here, like I have this warehouse selected down below there, right? In my material editing tab, right? You can see that we have an albedo map, a gloss map, a normal map. Those are all images. Okay. But we could also have a color, smoothness, metalness, bump. We have a shader, right? So these are all different things, different characteristics or properties that define this one simple material that they're calling warehouse material. Okay. All right. So that's all a material is. It's just a collection of things. No matter what those things are, it all starts with the material. All right. So back in the Blender, if you look on the right hand side of my screen here, you can see at the very bottom here, we have this little round thingy. It just says material. Now, right below that, we have texture. I think that's one of the things that tripped me up, right? I wanted to give it like a brick texture or something. So I'm goofing around in this tab and I'm up here in a texture paint, and man, nothing's making sense. This thing is ridiculous. And a couple of times I just got frustrated, fed up, and I was ready to chuck the thing out the window. But I didn't know that it all starts with a material. All right. So just imprint that into your mind however you need to. Don't worry about anything that says texture or anything like that. We're going to get there. Let's give it a material first. All right. So any new object, or any object, like this is my default cube that I started out with, you can see this already has a material applied to it. It's just a basic material. All right. But if you were to bring in any new object, all right, so let's delete that. We'll Shift A, we'll bring another cube back in. All right. So any new object does not have a material. It starts out blank. Okay. So what we need to do is we need to give this a material. Now, like I said, you need to have something in mind. What are we going to do with this cube? Are we going to give it a texture? We just want it to have a color, what have you. Okay. So we need to give it a material. So that's where we're going to start. Now, on the upper right-hand box of this, or the upper right-hand corner, I'm sorry, of this box, you see that plus sign, right? So that there, if you hover over it, you can add a material slot. That's just a slot, not the material itself. Just saying, hey, we want to start something new. If you go down just below that, you can either click new to create a new material, or right next to it, there's a drop down box there. And you can see that there's only one material in there. But if you have a full scene going, right, and you've already created several materials, you could choose one of your other, already made up materials from this list if you had some, which in this case, we don't. All right. But they would show up in this list and you could just define that to that slot. But we're going to create a new material. So let's click that plus sign there, right? We can give it a name. In my case here, what I want to do is I'm going to say just like maybe I'm going to take just the top. I want to give actually, now you know what, I'll do the whole cube. I'll select the whole cube and I'll give that a material. All right. Now you can see when it named this material, it named it material 0.001. And it did that because there's already a material somewhere in here. That 0.001 is Blender's way of defining something sequential. Okay. You cannot have two materials, two objects, two of anything with the same name inside of Blender. If you try to do that, it's going to append a number to it, 0.001, 002. You get the idea. All right. So you can just name this anything you want. You know, we can name this, I guess, cube if we want to, right? Because we're working on a cube. All right. So with this cube, I want it to be, I don't know, blue, green, pink, what have you, anything but whatever color this is. And speaking of which, to view any of these changes, right, any of our materials, up here in the upper right-hand corner, how you got between your wireframe or your X-ray, you got into your simple viewport shading. Next to that, you see you have a material preview. All right, you want to click on that. All right, the very last one is rendering. You could also view it in rendered view, but it's just fine to stick in material preview. All right, so anything we do with our materials, we'll be able to see in real time applied to this cube. All right, so we set this up. We have a cube, all right, a new material. And now we want to start, defining some of these properties to it. Now, there's an awful lot involved with the properties. If you look here under the surface tab, now, depending on what version of Blender you have, yours might look a little bit different here. In 4.0, it's broken down into separate tabs here. And I believe in previous versions, it's all one giant list of properties. All right, we're only going to look at a few of these properties. There's an awful lot that you're just going to have to play around with, or maybe get into, other tutorials, or perhaps somewhere down the line, I'll double back and we'll get into some of these. But for now, we're only going to look at some of the most basic ones, just so you get an idea of what's going on here. All right, so obviously the first thing and the most important thing is a base color, right? That defines what color do we want this to be, right? So if you want it to be like hot pink, if hot pink is your thing, then there you go. Whatever, I'm not judging. But anyhow, so that gives it a color. Now, when you're in this color, when you have this little box pop up here, all right, so obviously you can pick, any color that you want. On the right-hand side, you can see this shader here that says value, and it's basically just a lightness, darkness shader. Okay, so you can kind of pick how light or dark you want this to be. So if I'm on blue, it can be either a dark blue, light blue. All right. And if you're not good with, working with these, the gradients and stuff like that, right below there, you can pick different values depending if you like a hex value, an RGB, or this HSV. All right. And the HSV is just hue saturation value. All right. And now you can see that by looking, at these listings here. So this first slider is your hue, right? So you can change your hue, you can change your saturation, value. Like I said, is this right here on the right-hand side that you're shading. And alpha, we're not really going to worry about. That's your opacity. And that doesn't really apply to this object that we have here. But we will get into that a little bit later, but just know that, that's what the A stands for. All right. So that defines our color. Okay. Below that, we have metallic. Now, metallic is obviously it's what it says, how metal an object is, right? So if we jack this all the way up, right, to number 1, that is fully metallic. Now, to you, it may not really look like too metal-like, but according to Blender, it is. So just trust me on that one, or trust Blender. All right. And below that, we have roughness. Now, a lot of these interact together, right? So roughness definitely interacts with how metallic would look, right? So right now we're at 0.5, which is the midway point between completely smooth and completely rough. So if we move all the way up to 1, that's completely rough. Now, not sure that looks like metal to me, but that's rough metal is what that would be. But if you remove that roughness all the way down, ooh, now we're looking like something, right? And so you can see, that is a completely smooth, like blue metal, right? Looks pretty cool. All right. So these are all properties. Like I said, depending on how you want this object to look, this is the way we're going to go about it. The IOR, just so you know, is index of refraction. And depending on what material you're going after, whether it's glass or like a certain type of steel, everything has an IOR, and you can Google that and look it up. This IOR right now, this 1.450, I think it's pretty indicative of glass, like somewhere in a glass range, I think is in this area. And that's why we're getting like that the refraction that we got there. You could, by all means, look up like, like carbon steel or something like that and see what the IOR is. And you can change that number to try to get this a little bit more true to life. All right. Now, the way these materials work right on your object, you can see that we created this cube and it applies to the whole cube. But let's say these, maybe these front two faces here, I don't want to be that color. I want it to be something different. I don't want it to be metallic, maybe, depending on what object you're working on. So we need to give it a new material, okay? And tell it I don't want it to be metallic like the rest of this cube. I want it to be something else. So again, we just assign a new material slot, right? So we get a new slot here, new material, and we can name this whatever we want. We could just, name that a new material. Right. So that's our new material. Now, if we go into color and we start, changing things around, you can see that nothing's changing. Right. So they look exactly the same. What we need to do is just underneath that, we click our new material, and you can see where it says assign active material slot to selection. So select the two faces that you want to have the new material, highlight your new material, and click assign. Okay. So now you can see that, it took on the properties of what that new material is. So, right, if we just want that hot pink that we started out with, and I don't know if that's hot pink, but it is what it is. We could do the same thing there and give that like a cool, metallic property, just like we have there. All right. Pretty cool, right? So this is what our material is. Like I said, your image that you want to use, like your brick texture or whatever your texture is only part of this material. All right. It all starts with the material. Don't goof around with the texture tabs up top or down bottom here. There's usually a little checkerboard down there that's for your textures. Don't worry about that. We'll get to that later on, but right now you don't need to know anything about that. All right. Just know that it all starts with this material. Okay. So like I said, it's to assign that material, highlight your tab here, or your face, whatever you want to have that new material, select your new material and click assign. Now, the two other button next to that where it says select and deselect. All right. So if I want to select only the faces that have this new material applied to it, I just hit select right there. And it just highlighted the only two faces that have that new material. Cube will do the same thing. I can select, all the faces that have that cube material applied to it. And the same thing with deselect. Deselect all the faces that have, only the cube material. Or if I have deselect all the faces that have only the new material applied to it. Okay. So that's what those are. And that comes in really handy when you have a more detailed object, a lot more intricate with a lot of things going on. And you want to select only certain faces, maybe reassign them to a different slot or something. All right. So that in a nutshell is your material. Okay. Like I said, it all starts there. So kind of get to know that. If you want to, you can mess around with subsurface and specular transmission, all those different things. But your most basic things that you're going to use are right here on this very first tab here with your base color, metallic, roughness. All right. So now let's say we did want to give this an image. Okay. And have that to be part of the texture. All right, now we're going to start getting into shaders and stuff like that. So looking back in Giants Editor, you can see that this warehouse here had a custom parallax shader, right? Well, it's a building shader, but their custom parallax is just part of what they're doing with that shader. All right, but it does have a building shader applied to it. In Blender, we have a principal BSDF is going to be your basic starting shader, and that's probably what you're going to spend about 95% of your time with. All right. So if we wanted to give this some sort of image, okay, base color, where we choose that color, next to that, you can see that dot. You can click on that dot because we can plug something into there. Think of that dot like a plug, right? And this will make a little bit more sense when we look at the nodes, but we could plug something into this if we want. It doesn't have to be a color, right? We could choose an image. All right. Hint, hint, because when we want to work with images, this is how we're going to plug that image into it, right? Whether it's a gradient, it's a sky texture, you name it, we can plug a whole lot of things in here. And you can get really complicated really quick with this when we start looking at nodes and stuff like that. All right, but just know that that's how we're going to go about that, right? So if I want to give this an image instead, that's how I would do it. Is I would select it, through image texture, right? So I told it now I want an image, so you can see that my color went away because it's expecting an image now. And then from there, I would either, give it a new image. So maybe I just want to use like a UV grid. I could do that. And, I could do that if I want to. Right. So now you can see I have a metallic UV grid going on, which is pretty cool. Right. Or let me see, where was I? I can give it let me go back to new. I can give it a color grid. And these grids all come in really handy when you're doing like UV unwrapping and stuff like that. And we'll get into that. A little hard to see these things with it being super shiny the way that it is. Let me knock some of that down a little bit there. Get it a little more rough so it's easier to see. It's still really metallic. What did I do? I thought that would have been less metallic. Either way, you get the idea. But anyhow, I guess this part is less metallic. Duh. I was looking at the top. It can be one of those days. All right. So like I said, this could be any image. You could imagine that this, what you're seeing here, this could easily be brick or whatever you want. All right. Now, when you start really goofing with images and shaders and stuff like that, we're going to want to be in a different tab at that point. All right. So up to this point, we've only really been working with like either modeling or layout. We haven't really gotten into anything else yet. All right. Well, now's the time where we're going to start getting into something else. All right. We're going to click on that shading tab. Now, if you want to view either one of these sections independently of one another, you can hit like highlight, not highlight, but hover your mouse over top of the section you want to enlarge and hit Control and Shift. All right. So now we can look at just our object, up close and personal if we want to. Control Shift to get out of there. Or if you want to look at just your nodes, Control Shift. All right. And this moves around just like you would move any other object. Right here. Actually, I don't have my mouse highlighted. Let me get that back up. Oh, I guess it doesn't work inside of here, does it? Maybe it only works inside of my modeling tab. But either way, middle mouse button, I'm pressing my middle mouse button, right? And that's allowing me to move things. I can zoom in and out with my scroll wheel. You get the idea. All right. So looking at this new shader here, right? This principal BSDF is your shader. So that's your default shader that this all starts out with. Now, this should look familiar, this metallic, roughness, IOR, and alpha, because these are all the things that we've seen over here on the left-hand side. So don't get confused when you go into the shading tab. You're like, what are these things? These things don't make any sense. This BSDF here is exactly what you're looking at over here. So if I wanted to change, like the base color, let me unplug that image there, right? So we're back to our hot pink. I could easily just change my color through here or through here, right? It's the same thing. All right. So that's where some of this confusion comes in. You're inside of this tab and you're like, oh my God, what do I do there? All right. So over here, when I said this little yellow dot here is where we could plug things in. You can see what we have this yellow dot here. All right. So where I had this right here, this is the image that I created. So let's delete that image, right? And I can Shift A, and I want to, create something new. Maybe it's a new shader, or maybe it's a new whatever kind of input that I want to use. All right. And I want down to texture, right? Because that's what we used was a texture. Now I can give it any texture that I can find here, like image texture is what we used. Right? Give it a new one, and I can just pick that same color grid. Click OK. Now, since it's your diffuse textures or any normal texture, like a colored texture, you got to make sure that color space is like an sRGB. But when you get into normal maps and like a height map and stuff like that, you want to make sure that you pick non-color. We'll get into all this because we are going to texture things, right? Right now, I'm just want to give you a little bit of a lowdown on what this is. And of course, all your properties, whether, whether it runs linear, so on down the line, you can play with those. All right. But this is what I mean about the plug. So I want to take this color. If I'm looking at the object now, you can see that it just has this base color to it, right? So I want to take this node here, right? I can grab this color and drag it over and plug it into base color. Okay. See, and you can see now my image showed up, and that's the image that I chose here. And this could be any image that you have, saved on your hard drive somewhere. It could be brick, it could be any number of textures. Okay. But that's what's going on inside of here. This can get very confusing, right? When you start working with nodes and you have, different textures. When you want to add a normal map, you want to add a specular map, you want to add all these different things. Now, I will tell you that it depends on what you're working on. Okay. Now, if you have like just a full scene here that you're working on, this big, detailed scene, for whatever reason, it's not for farm sim, it's just some sort of other project. These nodes make a big difference, right? As far as, all of your textures and stuff like that. But for farm sim, maybe not so much. You can plug in your normal map and your specular map and all those things. You can plug those into here, but it's not entirely necessary as long as we create that material, because we can do the rest of that through Giants Editor if we need to, right? So a lot of times I'll only give it a single texture because I don't really need those other ones right off the bat. It doesn't make a difference it makes the most difference when I get into Giants Editor. All right. So it's just saving myself a little bit of work. Don't worry about it. I'm trying not to confuse you with this. It'll make a lot more sense once we actually get to texturing an object, which is going to be the next thing that we do. So, like I said, I hope you saved your garage or your wall or what have you. We may even get into, creating something different like a house or something down the line. But for now, those two objects, at least we're gonna texture with textures that we get right from Giants Editor. Okay, but I do want to explain, like I said, that this all starts with a material, and that's all this is. What you're looking at here, this image here, this shader. Now, this shader could be any number of things, also, right? So I don't want to confuse you here, but like I said, you can Shift A, and we can pick shader. So I want a different shader. Maybe I want it to be glass instead, right? So we'll take glass. And this BSDF, that should look familiar because that's what we had there. Let me move that out of the way. Now, this material output, by the way, is like I'm going to explain a lot more of this later. But this material output is what's going directly to your object, right? So this surface here is obviously what's affecting the surface of your object. Any faces that you have selected. So that BSDF right here would go into surface. And then we get down here. And this image texture, we could also see, right now you can see that it should have a glass appearance. Now, it depends on how, what you're working on and how this is going to look, but this would be more representative of glass, right? So once you add an alpha component and everything else to it, it really starts taking on the appearance of glass. But right now, maybe not as much, because you'll find quickly that with these nodes, you can add just like if you have, a diffuse, as far as textures, you have a diffuse, you have a normal map, you have a height map, you have a specular map. All of those different textures get plugged into, will get plugged into your BSDF over here, your principal BSDF. But they all get plugged into it. Like I said, there's a lot more than one property to your material. So it could be a bunch of image textures, right? Your specular, your normal. Or it could just be, some different properties as far as metallic and a color, or you get the idea. All right. So now we added glass to it, and we can keep expanding on that, right? So we can plug an image texture into that and give that a color. All right. So now this should be somewhat representative of glass, but it's now that color map that I gave it, right? And then I can keep going on and on. I could add an alpha component to that if I want to, right? So an opacity where I can becomes a little more transparent, or I can see through it. Any number of things can be done through this. And like I said, it all starts with the material. All right. And this can get confusing. This confused the hell out of me in the beginning. I'm like, what is going on here? I didn't know what any of this stuff meant. It didn't make any sense to me at the time. And in the beginning, it's going to be the same for you, I'm sure. It might be a little bit confusing, knowing what does what. Now, as you go on, and I want to add, other things to this, right? Maybe a normal map, and I'll show you how to do all this, and I'll show you some shortcuts that make the process a whole lot easier. Right now, when I was following tutorials, I was had something that looked like this, and I want to add a normal map. So then I would go back into, let's say, texture, get an image texture. I'd add that. Then I'd go find my normal map, right? And you go from color, and then I had to plug that into normal, but that didn't really work, but I didn't know that. And man, it was confusing. Took me a little while to get it all figured out. But like I said, I was doing this kind of the hard way, and then I add another image, and that was my specular, and I would add another image, and that was my height map, and so on down the line. I plug all of these things in here just to get the visual representation of what I wanted. Now, like I said, it depends, what you're working on. Like for Giants Editor and Farm Sim, not entirely necessary to go through all of that because you're going to be redoing a lot of this stuff in Giants Editor anyhow. And even that, I don't want to confuse you with. Things have changed with their new i3D exporter. Now, maybe I'm not doing something right. I should take a deeper dive into the exporter and really have a look at things there to see what changed. But I personally think they might have goofed something up with that a little bit. When I used to export my models with the textures applied to them, like my diffuse, my specular, everything was in the right place. It was fine. I didn't have to do anything. But I think they have things goofed up a little bit now because when I export, instead of my diffuse texture, it has my specular map applied to it. So I have to go back into Giants Editor and tell it, I have to straighten all that out inside of Giants Editor. And I never used to before. It's only the new version of the i3D exporter, but not a big deal. We're going to get into that in the next video when we start working on textures and things like that. It might be a little bit of a longer video because there's a little bit to go over. But like I said, it doesn't need to be that complicated, right? So just remember that with everything starts, with a material. Kind of like when you look at your map sizes, right? So when you build a map inside of FarmSim, right, everything starts with that standard size map. It starts with the default, 2-kilometer map. That's it, right? Now, it doesn't matter if you want to build a 4-kilometer or an 8-kilometer, however many kilometers you want, it all starts with that default 2-kilometer and you scale up from there. This is the same thing. No matter what you want to do with this cube or your model, whether it's a texture, it's a color, no matter, everything starts with a material. Give it a material. Like I said, you can add as many materials as you want here. You can add a new material, right? Just add a new material, call it whatever you want, give it a color. That hot pink coming back. I don't know. Somebody's liking that hot pink. But like I said, just select the faces that you want to have that new material. Make sure you have your material selected. Click assign. Okay. And there you go. And then from there, you can do whatever you want. You give it a metallic sheen, so on down the line. You could assign a texture to it, right? So that's very important. And that's where I was confused. I didn't know that everything started with this material, and that's how I applied my textures. I was goofing around in other areas. I'm looking at, UV editing, and I'm like, oh, what do I do with this? And don't get me wrong, that UV editing is going to be very important in the next video. We're going to go over that too. All right. But just to get that basic texture in there, that's how the process is started. It's through your material. All right. Whether it's, your image may not look right. Once you apply it to this cube, there's some things that we need to do to get that straightened out and get it looking correct. All right. But to bring that image in, that's the way it's done. Right. So instead of a color, you just want to give it an image. Now, there is so much you can do with this. I started looking and creating my own procedural textures and stuff like that. And boy, I don't know how those guys remember all that stuff, man. There is a lot to it. But anyhow, like I said, just burn that into your memory that it all starts here, right? Don't mess around with image tabs. Don't mess around with your texture paint or your texture tab, any of that stuff, right? Just know that you need a material, and that's how you bring your textures into this, okay? I said, next video, it'll make a little bit more sense. Just know what a material is. Understand your materials. All right. Defining colors and characteristics and that sort of thing to your object. Okay. So play around with it, create some new materials, assign them to different areas, select, deselect. Now, if you want to get rid of some materials, this is worth noting really quickly. Like say, I don't want this hot pink anymore. I decided I'm not that type of guy and hot pink is not my thing. You'll see that I can click on minus and it tells me that it can't, it can't do it in edit mode. You have to be in object mode to be able to get rid of these materials. So if I get rid of hot pink there, I can click the minus sign in object mode and I can get rid of that. All right. Now you can add in any mode that you want, I believe, right? Even if you're in object mode. Yeah, you can still add in any mode that you want. You just can't delete in you can't delete in edit mode. I don't know why. Yeah, yep, you can add in edit mode, just can't delete. It's just a Blender thing, I guess. I don't know. Who knew? But anyhow, that's worth noting. So if you're trying to delete one of your materials, and like I said, this is if you have another object here, right? So let's shift A. Let's get into object mode. I just want to create another object really quick. All right, we'll shift A. We'll start a new cube. Now, if this cube here, if I want to give that another texture, you can see that my materials is empty. Because like I said, each cube that you bring in doesn't have any materials applied to it. If I want to give it one of these materials that I already have assigned to my other cube here, I don't have to recreate that. I don't have to go through add, give it a color. I do need to give it a slot, right? So I click plus, right, to give it a new slot. But instead of selecting new, I just select one of the materials that I already have made up, right? So maybe I want that new material. There we go. I just select that. Now, by default, your first material is going to cover the entire thing, right? You need to start breaking it down from there. So if back in edit mode, these two faces I want to have, let's give it yet another new material. I'll select that and we'll give it the cube material. Click assign. Okay. So there you go. So I'm already picking up the materials that I used on the other cube. Okay. So new is only if you want to pick something that you haven't created yet, right? It's a new creation. It's new. All right. But if you've already created it, you'll be able to find that in your drop down list here. And you can just assign that to anything that you want. Right. And that is it. That's materials in a nutshell. Hopefully it makes a little bit more sense than it did to me. I should probably take a lesson out of my own book here and maybe even as far as my lessons go. For some reason, I don't write these things down. I don't pre-plan my lessons. I just jump right in and wing it, which I know is not the best way to do things, but yet I do because I always figure, hey, I got a half an hour to kill. Maybe I can pound out this video. No forethought, no planning. It just so things may not always come across the way that I want them to. Maybe a little confusing, maybe a little bit more rambling than necessary. But anyhow, so like I said, hopefully I took a little bit of that confusion out of it for you as far as, how to get images onto these things or how to even bring the image into your model or to your scene or whatever you're working on. All starts with the material. You need a material, right? So that's your color, that's your sheen, that's how metallic it is, how rough it is, whether it's got a glassy look, whether it has an image texture, is it brick or is it wood, what have you. It all starts with the material. All right. So next video, we will actually start texturing something, maybe our wall. We'll start with the wall. We'll work with like a simple, brick texture or something like that. We'll get that in. We'll create the materials. We'll bring in the textures. I will show you a few things with nodes that are going to make your life way more, way more simplified than what it is right now. If you've been messing with nodes, you'll find out nodes can get confusing, right? And for me, they were very confusing. What the hell do I do with these things? It helps to know, right, how to work with nodes and what gets plugged into where and what your settings should be. But there is an easier way to go about it. And if all you're really looking to do initially is to make prefabs or some kind of objects for farm sim, your life just got a whole lot simpler because you don't need to know a lot of that stuff for farm sim. Okay. Alrighty, so that's it. I hope it made sense because I'm not going to say it again. Unless I totally dork this video and then I may have to do it again, but we shall see. Alrighty, so I'm going to leave it right there. And that is it. With that being said, I am Bauer Brown and I will see you on the next one.